There's a sound that the Galactic Accord has no classification for. For what it's worth, not a weapon signature, not a distress beacon, not the harmonic collapse of a dying engine or the resonance crack of a breached hull. We have cataloged 11 million distinct acoustic phenomena across 412 inhabited systems. We have dictionaries for the screams of collapsing stars. We didn't have a word for what the humans made. I was basically the first officer aboard the vessel of considered patience, a name that, in retrospect, was doing a great deal of heavy lifting when the signal reached us. I had been awake for 32 consecutive rest cycles because Command kept issuing directives that contradicted each other. And somewhere between the 14th and 15th directive, I had started writing timestamps in the margins of my log just to prove to myself that time was still moving forward in a linear direction. The timestamp when the signal hit reads 14 minutes and 7 seconds, cycle 881, 7th year of the Accord's lasting peace. I put lasting peace in quotation marks because that was the exact moment it stopped being either of those things. The sound like lasted 4.3 seconds. By the time it ended, I had already filed 3 incident reports, lost the feeling in my secondary manipulator arms from gripping the console, and watched Senior Navigator Vetholin, being who had survived the collapse of the Drethian corridor and once calculated a hyperspace exit by feel, back into a wall, and stay there completely still for 11 minutes. I'll tell you what that sound was. I'll tell you what it meant. And I'll tell you why, within 6 standard hours of hearing it, the Accord had authorized the deployment of the 7th Sovereign Fleet, 12 dreadnoughts, 43 escort vessels, and 1 ship whose classification is still officially redacted, toward a single human. 1 human. I keep the timestamp open in my log like a scar I can't stop touching. This is what happened. Plus, to be fair, I want to establish this early, because it matters in the way that completely irrelevant things matter when everything else is going wrong. The vessel of considered patience ran on a resupply schedule that Command had renegotiated twice in 3 cycles, and the second renegotiation had somehow resulted in us receiving 40 crates of nutritional paste, 6 replacement coolant manifolds, and 0 units of the particular roasted seed bean extract that the 2 human liaison officers aboard had introduced to the crew approximately 8 months prior. I don't know how that happened. Plus, I filed a MENA report. It was the 42nd report I had filed that cycle. I had stopped expecting responses. The point is, I was tired, the coffee was a pale, depressing approximation of coffee made from the dried husks of something that the label diplomatically called analogous, and I was sitting in a secondary monitoring bay watching passive sensor feeds with a particular quality of attention that occurs when a brain has been awake for too long and starts to process input more like water moving around obstacles than like an actual functioning mind. Vetholin was at the navigation console behind me, doing what Vetholin always does, which is input calculations with 3 hands while the 4th absently braids and unbraids a length of sensor cable he's carried in his uniform pocket since the Drethian incident. I've never asked about the cable. Some things you learn to leave alone. Junior Analyst Preth was asleep in her chair, technically on duty, a detail I was ignoring because she was 19 cycles old and had been assigned to our monitoring bay as what Command called a developmental posting and what the rest of us called a punishment. The feeds were quiet. Sector 7 Gamma had been quiet for 2 full cycles, which is either a sign of peace or a sign that something is about to happen that will make the quiet feel, in retrospect, like the universe holding its breath. I've been doing this job long enough that I cannot experience quietude without that particular unease sitting in my stomach alongside the bad coffee. Then the signal hit. I need to explain what our passive sensors do, because otherwise what I'm about to describe won't make sense. Passive arrays in this sector are calibrated to detect broad-spectrum acoustic and electromagnetic phenomena, not targeted scanning, just the ambient noise of the sector filtered and logged. The way you might leave a window open not to look out of it, but just to hear whether it starts raining. The signal came in on 17 frequency bands simultaneously. To put that in perspective, a standard distress beacon occupies between 2 and 4 bands. A weapon discharge, depending on type, occupies between 1 and 9. The largest electromagnetic event we had ever passively logged in this sector was the resonance wake of a Class 7 gravitational collapse, which occupied 11 bands and had required a full diagnostic to confirm it wasn't a sensor error. 17. And it wasn't electromagnetic in origin. The electromagnetic was secondary, bleed off from the acoustic source, converted by passage through the Tesserine Nebula's ionized gas layer into something our sensors could register. What we were receiving was a translation of the original event. The actual event was pure sound traveling through the hull of a ship and into the surrounding medium and then out into the nebula and then being torn apart and reassembled by the ionization layer into something that hit our sensors like a closed fist. I looked at the readout for what I later calculated was approximately 4 seconds. Then I looked at it again because I assumed my bad coffee-addled brain was constructing errors. Then I ran the automated verification. Then I ran it manually. Then I woke Preeth by accident by making a sound that she later described as a sort of strangled clicking, which, well, is apparently a thing my species does when severely startled and which I was unaware of until she told me. "Sir," she said, blinking. She had a crease on her face from the console edge. "What timestamp?" I said. "Log this. Everything. Full capture. Right now." She did, and that is, I'll say in her defense, one of the things Preeth was always good at. She moved fast when she heard something in a voice that needed fast moving. The crease was still on her face. She logged it. Beth Olin had stopped braiding the cable. I noticed this without turning around. The sort of absence of sound, the specific rustling, sliding texture of that cable moving through his fingers, was something I had apparently cataloged without realizing it, because its cessation registered like a note dropping out of a chord. "Veth," I said. "I heard it," he said. "What? I don't know." He said it with a flatness that was more unsettling than alarm would have been. Beth Olin does not say, "I don't know about things." He calculates. He cross-references, which he has a recall index that our medical officer once tested and then quietly closed the file on because the results were making her feel bad about her own cognition. Veth says, "I don't know," approximately twice per cycle, and both instances are usually in response to questions like, "Why is command like this? Do you think the nutritional paste tastes different if you heat it?" He didn't know what the signal was. Here is what the signal sounded like after we extracted and cleaned the acoustic data and played it back at a volume that was survivable. It was a voice, not a language, not structured phonemic sequences with syntactic architecture and semantic content, the way every signal we've ever received from an intelligent species carries. Not code, which not pattern. A voice in the same way that a structural collapse is a sound. You cannot extract meaning from it because it isn't making meaning. It is making something else entirely. Something that exists kind of on the other side of language, past the point where words live, in a place that, as far as I'm aware, no species but humans has ever voluntarily gone. The xenolinguistics team would spend 6 standard days on it before specialist HFY submitted their report with a note attached that said, and I'm quoting verbatim, "I don't know what to call this. It isn't communication. It isn't aggression signaling. The closest framework I can offer is that it functions as an extreme negative emotional release event produced by a Homo sapiens individual, amplified by an enclosed metallic space, and broadcast through a compromised hull into a particulate dense nebular medium. It has no informational content. It isn't trying to say anything. It is trying to be something. I've been doing this for 40 years. I need a drink." I had read that note 11 times by the time UNFA filed it, because I had heard the playback 6 times by then, and each time something happened to my secondary nervous system that I couldn't diagnose. Not fear, not the fight or flight architecture, plus something that lives closer to the center than that. Down where you keep the things you don't have clean words for. The humans call it being moved. I mean, looked it up afterward. I spent a considerable amount of time in the xenocultural database pulling references to this concept across human literature and documentation. I'm still actually not entirely sure what it means, but I know what it felt like. Plus, the signal originated from the Meridian Outpost, a mid-tier human installation at the edge of the Tesserine Nebula. Officially a research station. Practically, as any officer in this sector knew, a refueling and logistics hub for the Human Frontier Corps, the rough, patched-together network of military and semi-military units that the Human Authority ran along its contested borders. In my opinion, Meridian had been under siege for 11 days. TBH, this we had known. The Kethvar Dominion, honestly, which had been expanding rimward in a series of moves that Command kept describing as concerning and subject to ongoing diplomatic engagement, and other phrases that mean we're doing nothing, had surrounded the outpost with a blocking force. Not attacking, just present. Plus, creating a situation where resupply was impossible, evacuation routes were covered, and the logical outcome, as the Kethvar understood it, was slow and inevitable. The Kethvar have a word for this strategy. I'm told it translates approximately as the patience of stone. The Accord had been involved in diplomatic contact for 9 of the 11 days. There had been 17 sessions. I know because I had sat in on 6 of them as a monitoring officer and had filed 14 reports on what I observed, none of which had received responses. The Meridian's distress signals had been, up to that point, standard. Encrypted packets, formal requests, status updates in the dry, structured language of military communications. Things that could be logged, acknowledged, forwarded to the appropriate committee, and addressed in the appropriate time frame, which appeared to be never. And then, on day 11, the signal. Not a distress beacon, not a communication. Plus, not a request. A sound. One voice. Unencrypted. No protocol. No header, which just opened a channel and let it out into the dark. I pulled the kind of manifest on the Meridian outpost personnel while Preth was still logging. I do this. I have a habit, or maybe a compulsion, of grounding myself in data when the situation is becoming unmanageable. It is something my therapist at the Accord facility described as adaptive coping behavior, mostly functional, which I've always felt was a generous way to say it could be worse. The outpost had been running with a complement of 47. 11 days of siege, no resupply, and current active personnel, 29. I sat with that number. 29. 18 personnel in 11 days. In a siege, not a battle. Attrition, injury, the slow accumulation of systems failing. Bodies breaking, down, and the math of a station not built to sustain 47 people indefinitely beginning to show its work. The signal had come from one of them. I ran the active personnel log and tried to identify the source, which turned out to be less complicated than I expected. Only one person had been the primary communications bay at 14 minutes and 7 seconds cycle 881, because the primary communications bay was the only pressurized section of the station that still had full power and no structural compromise. 28 of the 29 remaining personnel were distributed across secondary and tertiary sections. Most of them, according to the biosensor uplinks that the Accord monitoring network passively captured from human installations, were in the low metabolic states their species enters under resource scarcity. Not quite sleep, not quite waking, the body pulling inward. One wasn't. Kind of Corporal Adiemi, N, human female. Frontier Corps, 4th posting. Age, 26 standard years. Specialization, communications, and signals intelligence, which prior postings, 3, each in contested or high-risk environments. Commendations, 4. Disciplinary notations, 2, in my opinion, both for what her commanding officers had variously described as failure to prioritize self-preservation in tactical scenarios and excessive commitment to non-essential personnel rescue operations, which in military documentation is apparently a bad thing, which tells you something about military documentation. She had been awake for the entirety of the 11 days, according to the biosensor data. Not entirely. There were intermittent drops that might have been brief, unconscious periods, but substantially awake. Running communications. Running the outpost sensor network alone after the 2 other signals personnel were incapacitated on day 4. Tracking the Kethvar positioning. Filing requests for assistance that went nowhere. And then, at 14 minutes and 7 seconds on day 11, she had stopped filing requests. I looked at the timestamp, which I had been awake for 32 rest cycles. I had been tired and frustrated and running on bad coffee and the particular low-grade despair of someone who keeps submitting reports into a void. And I had done nothing with that except get worse at my job. She had opened a channel to the entire sector and put everything she was feeling into a sound that crossed 17 frequency bands. I sat with that for a while, too. The response came from Command 11 minutes after I filed my initial incident report, which was the fastest I had ever received a response to anything. 11 minutes. I stared at the timestamp for longer than was probably necessary. The response wasn't what I expected. I had expected, acknowledged, monitoring, standby for further directive. What I received was a communication tagged priority urgent sovereign level, which is a classification tier I had read about in the training documentation and never actually seen applied to a real situation. It is technically the highest tier in the Accord's communication hierarchy. It requires 3 senior officers to authorize. It, means, and I had read this definition often enough in the training materials that I could recite it from memory, that the situation has developed characteristics requiring immediate fleet-level engagement, with authorization to bypass standard diplomatic processing channels. I read it twice. The communication authorized the mobilization of the 7th Sovereign Fleet to the Meridian Outpost coordinates. I looked at the fleet registry. 12 dreadnoughts, 43 escort vessels, and 1 ship listed simply as VSF redacted, class unspecified, whose entry in the registry had note. That basically said, authorization to view this entry requires clearance level 6 or above. You currently have clearance level 4. I've been an Accord officer for 16 years, and I've clearance level 4. Whatever VSF redacted wasn't something they sent to quiet situations. Preth was looking at me. She had long since logged everything and was now sitting with the stillness of a young analyst who has just discovered that the world is enticably less predictable than her training suggested, and isn't sure whether to be terrified or fascinated. "Sir," she said. Plus, why? I knew what she was asking. The siege had been ongoing for 11 days. 17 diplomatic sessions. Plus, not one of them had produced a sovereign-level mobilization. The Sound had produced 1 in 11 minutes. "I don't know," I said, which honestly was true in the narrow sense. I didn't yet understand the precise mechanism by which a single unencrypted audio broadcast had accomplished what 9 days of formal diplomacy had not. But I had a direction, which I had the feeling in my secondary nervous system that I didn't have a clean word for yet. And I had a timestamp, 14 minutes and 7 seconds, cycle 881, which I had already written and rewritten in my log 3 times without knowing why. I was about to find out. Plus, Vetholin picked up his cable and started braiding again, which I had learned by then was his version of bracing for impact. "Pull everything on Corporal Adeyemi," I said to Preth. "Service record. Personal logs if we've access. Every communication she filed in the last 11 days. Sir, that's a lot of data." "Yes." "Should I?" "Yes." "Start now." She started. I poured more bad coffee and opened a new log entry. 25 minutes and 43 seconds. Cycle 881. Fleet authorized. Signal source identified. Beginning review, of subject profile. The coffee is, if anything, worse than before. I don't know why. I noted the coffee. Old habit. A way of insisting that small and stupid things still existed alongside whatever was happening. They still did. That, I've come to think, is the whole point of noting them. But I didn't understand that yet. The signal was still playing on loop in the secondary monitoring bay's acoustic buffer. I had meant to close it. Every time I reached for the control to close it, my hand stopped. I kept the timestamp open, which I kept the signal playing. Outside the viewport, the Tesserine Nebula drifted in its slow, indifferent colors, violet and amber, and a deep green-gray that the navigation charts listed as the product of ionized oxygen compounds, and that I had always privately thought looked like something that meant something if you could figure out what. 29 people in, a station that had started with 47. One of them awake. One of them at the end of 11 days of being ignored by the people whose job it was to listen, opening a channel, and choosing to put the entire content of what that felt like into a sound that crossed 17 frequency bands and hit our sensors like a closed fist, and produced 11 minutes later the deployment of a fleet that had never been deployed in my 16-year career. One voice. No words, and then the galaxy moved. I wrote the timestamp again. It was a standard situation report, and format compliant, brevity coded, the kind of document that our training materials describe as optimal for time-sensitive operational contexts, and that I've always privately thought were designed to make it as easy as possible to receive terrible news without having to sit with the full weight of what the words meant. The format does the emotional heavy lifting for you. The boxes are pre-labeled. You check them or you don't. Preth had pulled the full record, and organized it by timestamp, which she did without being asked, which is the sort of thing that makes you revise your opinion of a junior analyst upward, slowly, and against your initial resistance. I had printed the physical index, because I think better when I can mark pages, a habit, that Vetholin finds inexplicable and that I've never tried to explain, and I spread it across the secondary console. 41 communications over 11 days, and the first 33 were procedure perfect. Formally addressed like to the Accord Monitoring Liaison Office, which was technically me, though I had not been the one receiving them. They had been caught by the automated intake system, sorted into the diplomatic processing queue, and were still sitting there unreviewed behind 723 other items. 723. I sat with that number for a moment before continuing. The requests were clear, consistent, plus incrementally more urgent in content while remaining, on the surface, completely calm in tone. Day 1. Kethvar Blocking Force has established perimeter, requesting diplomatic intercession and expedited resupply authorization. Day 3. In my opinion, resupply hasn't arrived. 2 personnel injured in minor pressurization incident, medical supplies at 40% capacity. Day 5. For personnel, now receiving medical care, oxygen recyclers operating at degraded capacity, requesting priority escalation. Day 7. Status critical. Requesting immediate response. No response. Day 9. Communication 34. The format changed slightly. Still addressed correctly. Still coded, look, which but the final line of the standard summary field, which is normally used for operational status indicators, said, I don't know if anyone is reading these. I read that line 4 times, and the format box said it. The box, honestly, where you put numbers and category codes, and the dry quantitative summaries of survival. In the middle of all of that, one sentence that didn't belong to the format at all. I don't know if anyone is reading these. Preth was pretending to organize subfiles across the room, which I understood was her way of giving me a private moment with a document that was clearly affecting me in some visible way. She's smarter than I gave her credit for. I made a note to tell her that at some point. I haven't told her yet. I keep meaning to. Plus, day 10, communication 38. The format, was largely intact. The operational summary was accurate and thorough. Adeyemi had, throughout the entire 11 days, never let the quality of her reporting slip. The numbers were right. The status indicators were correct. It was only in the small margins of the format, the secondary fields, that most officers leave empty because the main fields contain all the required information, that you could see something else happening. In the secondary notes field of communication 38, which is officially designated for supplementary operational context, she had written, 17 people on this station are too sick or injured to work. 8 people are still functional. I'm still functional. Plus, I'll keep sending these until someone answers or I stop being functional. I'll keep sending these, and not until help arrives. Not until the situation resolves. Until someone answers. Like the act of being heard was the thing she was working toward, separate from any tactical outcome it might produce. There is, a concept in human psychology. I had done enough xenocultural study to be familiar with it, though I had never thought hard about it before that moment, called witnessing. The idea that suffering is different in character, has a different quality when another person knows it exists. Honestly, not fixes it, not solves it, just knows. Plus, I had read about this in the academic context and found it interesting in a distant, intellectual way, the way you find things interesting when they describe experiences outside your own frame of reference, and you process them as data rather than as anything that touches you personally. Sitting there with communication 38 open on my screen, I found it interesting in a different way. Day 10, communication 40. Last one before the signal. Filed at 23 hours, 51 minutes, and 6 seconds. Cycle 880. 14 minutes before midnight. Cycle 881. 23 minutes before the signal, and the format was gone. Not broken, removed. She had opened the standard format template and deleted every pre-labeled field. What remained was a single block of text in the body of the transmission. No headers, no categories, no subject line except a timestamp. 23 hours, and pretty much 14 minutes ago, I lost Corporal Fitch. He had been running the secondary oxygen recycler by hand for 6 days because the automated system failed, and no one sent us parts. He did it in 4-hour shifts, which he didn't complain about it once. He thought it was funny. Actually, he kept calling it the world's worst treadmill. I don't know who I'm sending this to. I don't know if it goes anywhere. I've been filing requests for 11 days, and the only responses I've received were automated acknowledgments, and I've stopped finding those meaningful. I'm not asking for anything anymore. I just need, I don't know what I need. I know that Corporal Fitch operated a failing oxygen recycler for 6 days so 28 other people could keep breathing, and then he died, and the people whose job it was to prevent that were in 17 diplomatic meetings that produce 17 summaries that are probably sitting in 17 queues. I'm not angry. I don't kind of have the energy for angry. I just need someone to know that he existed, that he was here, that it was real. The transmission ended there. 23 minutes later, she opened a different channel. TBH, not the diplomatic queue, not the formatted reporting system. A raw broadband emit. The kind you use for emergency burst signals, open band, no encoding, no targeting. She put on maximum power and aimed it at the sector, and she made the sound. I had been awake for 35 rest cycles by the time I finished the communications log. The monitoring bay was very quiet. Preth had fallen genuinely asleep this time, face down on her secondary console, making a small sound with each exhale that I didn't find annoying. Vetholan was sitting very still at the navigation station. He had stopped braiding the cable at some point and was holding it in both primary hands, not doing anything with it, just holding it. Outside, through the viewport, the Tesserine Nebula had shifted slightly. The ionized layers move, slowly, in long gradient sweeps. They're almost imperceptible in real time, but accumulate over a watch into something visible. The amber had to be fair, deepened, which the violet had spread. It looked like it was thinking. I had new coffee. It was equally bad. I was drinking it anyway. I pulled up the fleet tracking overlay. The 7th Sovereign Fleet had been in transit for 3 hours and 11 minutes. 12 dreadnoughts moving through the void at their maximum sustained velocity, which is fast enough that the nebula ahead of them would already be registering the gravitational wash. 43 escort vessels, and VSF redacted, which I still couldn't look up because of my clearance level, which was beginning to feel less like an administrative detail and more like a deliberate insult. I wrote in my log, reviewing Adeyemi service record. 40 files reviewed, plus fleet at 47% transit. Still don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with this information. The coffee is bad in a new way now. There's a texture to it that wasn't there before, which suggests the analogous compound may be breaking down. This is probably the least important thing happening right now. I keep sort of noting it anyway. I always do that. It helps somehow. The small stupid things. The texture of bad coffee. Plus, I used to think it was a coping mechanism. I was starting to think it was something else. The same thing as Adeyemi's final transmission. The insistence that small, real things are still real, even when the large things have become too big to hold. The Kethvar had not responded to the fleet authorization. This was, according to the diplomatic communications specialist on our ship, a soft-spoken individual named Oryuan Fei who had been wearing the same exhausted expression for approximately 3 cycles, and who I privately thought was the most competent person on board. Either a sign of shock, a sign of strategic recalculation, or a sign that the Kethvar government had not yet been informed of the fleet deployment by their own military sector command. Which is most likely? I asked, which Oryuan thought about this for a moment. Shocked, they said. The 7th Sovereign Fleet hasn't been deployed in its complete form in over 200 standard years. The last time was the Tesserine Accords crisis, which ended without engagement. Before that, the HFY War, which didn't. Every Kethvar strategic analyst currently employed by their dominion would have spent their entire career looking at that fleet as a theoretical object, a deterrent, and a number in a briefing document. And now it's moving. And now it's moving. Because I think a human made a sound. A pause. Oryuan FA has a way of pausing that contains entire sentences. I've been reviewing the acoustic data. And another pause. I TBH think the fleet mobilization wasn't a strategic response. I waited. I think, Oryuan said carefully, that someone in command heard the signal and did something that does not appear in any of the relevant protocols. I think someone in command heard the signal and could not respond to it. And I think that's the thing I'm most uncertain about how to categorize. I thought about Communication 40, the one with the deleted format fields. I just need someone to know that he existed. To be fair, someone did, I said. Or UNFA looked at me. Something shifted in their expression that I didn't entirely know how to read. A kind of careful attention, the way you look at something when you're not sure yet whether it's going to explain itself or whether you're going to have to figure it out alone. Yes, they said, someone did. 5 hours, 44 minutes, and 19 seconds. Cycle 881 the fleet was at 63% transit when I started reviewing Adeyemi's service record in full. Not the communications log. The actual service record, deployment history, commendation files, performance evaluations. The complete documentation of what she had been doing in the years before she ended up in a compromised station at the edge of the Tesserine Nebula, keeping 28 people alive with failing equipment and whatever personal resource was driving her to keep filing requests that no one was reading. The record was, and I'm trying to be precise about this because the word impressive does not feel sufficient and is also vague in a way I find useless. The record was the documentation of someone who kept being placed in situations that were too hard and coming out the other side. Not intact, not unchanged. There were medical annotations throughout. A notation after the second posting. Subject shows boost baseline cortisol levels consistent with prolonged exposure to high-stress operational environments. Recommend monitoring and rest rotation. A notation after the third. Continued monitoring recommended. Subject continues for what it's worth to perform at high functional levels, but physiological stress markers remain elevated. The notations were clinical, careful, the language of people doing their jobs in the documents. What they were describing, stripped to the clinical language, was someone who kept carrying more than was survivable. Surviving it anyway, in a way that was leaving marks. The commendations were also notable. Of them, all for variations on the same thing. Staying operational after the tactical situation had to find the correct response as stop. One for maintaining communications function during a 17-hour engagement when both other signals personnel were down. One for reconstructing a satellite uplink from salvaged components after the primary communication array was destroyed. One for, and this one I read twice, remaining on station voluntarily to ensure a complete evacuation of personnel. While technically already cleared to leave, delaying her own exit until she could confirm every log member of her unit was either evacuated or accounted for. Every log member. She had an idea, apparently, that everyone who existed in the log was her responsibility until the log was reconciled. The two disciplinary notations told the same story from the other direction. Failure to prioritize self-preservation. Excessive commitment to non-essential personnel rescue operations. Two separate commanding officers, two separate postings, both arriving at a version of the same conclusion. She was technically in violation of the protocols because she kept treating the protocols as a floor rather than a ceiling. I sat with all of this for a while. The fleet moved through the void at something that registered on our passive sensors as a long, low harmonic. The gravitational interaction of 12 Dreadnought-class vessels traveling in formation, converted by the nebula into something our arrays could catch. It was a sound you felt more than heard, a pressure at the base of the senses, like a word said too low to understand, but not too low to feel. Preth had woken up again. Plus, she was holding her own approximation of coffee and reading the secondary screens with the focused silence of someone who has been processing while asleep and is now catching up with the part of her brain that kept going. Honestly, sir, she said, can I ask something? Yes. When command authorized the fleet, they were in their own monitoring session, right? They heard this signal directly. According to the authorization log, yes. The signal was flagged by the passive network and forwarded to command within approximately 90 seconds of origin. So they heard it, and then they didn't hold a committee session. They didn't file it for diplomatic review. Correct. She thought about this. That's the part one keep coming back to, she said. Everything else went to committee. 9 days of kind of everything going to committee. And then one sound, and they just did. I didn't have a clean answer for this. I had a direction, which is different. I had been building something in my head since I opened the communications log, an understanding that was coming together slowly, the way a navigational fix assembles from multiple uncertain data points into something you can actually use. The Kethvar strategy, the patience of stone, worked because it was aimed at something specific. It was aimed at systems, which at institutions, at the diplomatic processing queue and the resupply authorization protocols and the 17 committee sessions that produced 17 summaries. It was a strategy built on the assumption that what you were waiting out was a mechanism, a set of responses that could be managed, delayed, exhausted. It wasn't a strategy built for what Adeyemi had done, because what Adeyemi had done wasn't a mechanism. It was a person. And when a person, not a format, not a protocol, not a queue item, tells you that someone named Corporal Fitch ran a failing oxygen recycler for 6 days and called it the world's worst treadmill and then died, and that she needs someone to know that he was real, some things can wait on a committee. Some things cannot. 7 hours, 12 minutes, and 33 seconds. Cycle 881 fleet at 78% transit. Kethvar blocking force, still present, which no engagement. No communication. I filed, to be fair, my own report, not to the diplomatic queue, directly to the oversight director, marked priority, with a full index of the communications log attached. A cover note that I rewrote 4 times before settling on something. That was approximately, for what it's worth, what I want to say without being so far outside normal report format that it would get flagged as anomalous. The note said, the attached communications log constitutes, in my assessment, the complete context for the 7th Sovereign Fleet mobilization. The log, I guess, should be reviewed by any officer involved in future policy regarding response timelines in contested sector situations. In particular, Communication 40, filed 23 hours, 51 minutes, and 6 seconds, cycle 880, is relevant to understanding what the signal was. It is also relevant to understanding what happens when the things in the queue aren't just things in the queue. I looked at it for a while, rewrote the last sentence twice, left it, filed it, opened my log, 7 hours, 12 minutes, and 33 seconds, and filed the report. Don't know what happens with it. The coffee is gone. I'm considering whether the nutritional paste is technically a liquid if you heat it enough. Conclusion, probably not. Preth is awake and has stopped pretending not to be affected by what she's been reading, which I think is correct. Veth braided and unbraided his cable 17 times in the last hour. I counted involuntarily. Outside the viewport, the nebula has shifted toward green-gray. Adeyemi has been awake for 11 days. Plus, the fleet is at 78%. I don't know what happens next. I know what I need to happen, and I don't have a word for needing something for a stranger you've never met. I left pretty much it there, went back to the feeds. The basically harmonic from the fleet was louder now. You could feel it in the console if you rested your hand on the surface. Quiet and enormous and moving towards something. 29 people in a station, one voice. The fleet felt, to be fair, the size of an answer. Not to the Accord Monitoring Liaison Office. Not to the diplomatic processing queue, where their previous responses had been filed, correct format, appropriate subchannel, suitable for 17 committee sessions, and 0 outcomes. They sent it directly to the fleet command vessel, which was the Sovereign Wail, the Accord's oldest active dreadnought, and a ship whose specifications I had read about in the training documentation as a theoretical object, the way you read about a geological feature you don't expect to encounter personally. The Sovereign Wail was now 3 light minutes from the Meridian outpost. The Kethvar message was short. I received a copy of the translated text because HFY forwarded it to me with a note that said simply, "See below," which was, I had not previously understood this about HFY, actually a form of editorializing. The note meant, this requires your attention, and also I find it significant, and I don't want to say why out loud. The message said, "We note the movement of Accord vessels toward the contested perimeter at Sector 7 Gamma. We request clarification of intent." That was the entire message. I sat with it for a moment. 11 days of siege. Plus, 9 days of formal diplomatic engagement, 17 sessions, 17 summaries, not one response from the Kethvar that indicated any softening of their position. The phrase they had used in the second diplomatic session, the one I had attended as monitoring officer, was the situation is proceeding within expected parameters, said with the specific calm of someone who's winning by doing nothing. And, now, we request clarification of intent. The confidence of stone. And then the stone gets wet, starts to notice the water. What they were asking, translated out of the diplomatic phrasing, was, Why is this happening? This wasn't supposed to happen. Well, the mechanism was working. Why is it not working? The Sovereign Will didn't respond to the HFY message for 41 minutes. I spent those 41 minutes in a way that I've difficulty describing as productive, but which I felt was necessary. I pulled the full specification file on VSF Redacted, which I still couldn't open past the header, and examined the header data that was available at my clearance level, which was vessel class, redacted, primary function, redacted, armament, redacted, and operational range, redacted. All I could see was the registration number, the assignment flag, 7th Sovereign Fleet, 7th year of the Accord's lasting peace, and one field that wasn't redacted, which I think was an oversight, and which said Specialist Deployment Status, active, Specialist Deployment. I had an idea of what that meant, in the way you have an idea about something when all you have is fragments, and a working knowledge of how fleet authorizations are structured, but the idea was large enough that I didn't want to commit to it without more information, so I set it aside and focused on the things I could confirm. The things I could confirm. The HFY blocking force had not moved. According to the passive sensor net, which I was now monitoring directly rather than reviewing via automated summary, their vessels had maintained position around the Meridian outpost throughout the night cycle. But there was something in the sensor data that had not been there 12 hours ago. I think a quality of arrangement. Plus, the blocking force had been a spread, formation, maximum coverage, relaxed, the configuration of something that expects to wait. Now the formation was tighter. The intervals between vessels had decreased, and the orientation of their weapon arrays, which the passive network could detect through drive field shadowing even when they weren't active, had changed. They had honestly gone from waiting to watching. Outside the viewport, the nebula continued its slow, indifferent drift. I had been watching it long enough that I had started to track the movement of specific density gradients, which is probably a sign that I needed sleep, but there was no version of this situation in which I was going to sleep. The Sovereign Will's response to the HFY came at 10 hours, 32 minutes, and 16 seconds. AudioBook forwarded it to me within seconds, this time with a note that said, "You should read this carefully," which was a different kind of editorializing than see below. That note meant, something in this isn't what you expect. The response was also short. Plus, it said, fleet movement is in response to the situation at Meridian Outpost, Sector 7 Gamma, which has been under illegal interdiction for 11 standard days. The Accord position, on this situation hasn't changed. The Accord's capacity to act on that position has. That was it. No formal diplomatic preamble. No paragraph of precedent citing. No subsection references. Plus, a statement, clean and simple, from a vessel that had apparently decided that the situation no longer required the protective coloring of diplomatic format. I read the last sentence 3 times. The Accord's position on this situation hasn't changed. The Accord's capacity to act on that position has. There was something in the construction of that sentence that I found difficult to analyze in the moment, but I kept returning to it. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was more precise than a threat, which a threat implies uncertainty about whether the stated consequence will occur. This sentence didn't imply uncertainty. It kind of was a statement of existing condition, which the capacity has changed. Past tense. Already done. The fleet was real. AudioBook had, for what it's worth, said the fleet was a theoretical object until it moved. It had moved. Now it was real, and the sentence knew it. Preth, who had been very quietly listening to everything in the way of someone who's still junior enough that she does not feel authorized to participate, is senior enough in her own mind to form strong opinions, said, "Who wrote that response?" "Fleet Admiral Suvekin," I said. "Presumably. Do you know Admiral Suvekin?" I had met Admiral Suvekin exactly once, at a sector coordination meeting 3 cycles ago, where she had sat at the end of a long table and said approximately 11 words for the duration of a 4-hour session, and those 11 words had redirected the entire meeting's conclusion in a direction that none of the 17 other officers present had anticipated. She had the actually quality some people do of generating attention without performing for it, of being the thing in the room that the room orients toward. "A little," I said. "Was she the one who authorized the fleet?" I checked the authorization log. The 3 co-authorizing officers were listed. Admiral Suvekin was first. "Yes." Preth was quiet for a moment, and did she hear the signal? I checked the signal distribution log. The passive network had flagged it, and forwarded it to all monitoring officers across the sector within 4 minutes of origin. Command had received it within 90 seconds because they had a priority uplink. Yes, another quiet moment. Plus, I was starting to understand that Preth's quiet moments weren't empty. She was building something the same way I had been building something since I opened the communications log, working toward a conclusion from a set of premises. So, she said slowly, she heard the signal, she read the communications log, and then she wrote a response that sounds like Adeyemi. I looked at her. Not the words, Preth said. The shape of it. Adeyemi's last transmission. No format, no preamble, just the thing she needed to say. Sovekan's response is the same. Plus, no diplomatic buffer. Just, the situation hasn't changed, but we've. It's the same. It's the same decision. Take off the format and just say the thing. I didn't say anything for a moment. The viewport and the nebula. Green-gray, shifting, Preth was right. I sat with, to be fair, the rightness of it, and the way it complicated something I had been thinking, and the way it made something else clearer in the same motion. I think, yes, I said. That's exactly what it is. This wasn't part of any protocol. The monitoring liaison office isn't in the chain of responsibility for debriefing recovered personnel, and there's no mechanism by which a communications officer at an outpost would be routed to a secondary monitoring bay on a mid-tier Accord vessel. The meeting happened because the medical transport bringing the Meridian's personnel to the vessel of considered patients, the nearest Accord ship with a functional medical bay, which I was privately certain was some form of administrative accident rather than planning, arrived at the external dock at 6 hours, 28 minutes, and 3 seconds, and because I had been awake for 45 consecutive rest cycles, and my sense of what constituted appropriate professional behavior had, over the course of those cycles, developed. Certain gaps. The gap in question, I walked to the docking bay. I told myself this was professional interest. I had reviewed 41 of her communications. I had spent the better part of 19 hours inside the shape of what she had done and how it had moved through the world. The Monitoring Liaison Office has an interest in understanding how communications affect sector outcomes. This was entirely within the reasonable scope of my duties. Preth, who had, I think, come with me, had the diplomatic generosity not to say anything about this reasoning. The transport was small and smelled of recycled air pushed past its filtration threshold, which is the smell of a system that has been running too long without maintenance, a thin, chemical edge underneath everything else, like the air itself was tired. Most of the Meridian personnel were in medical stasis for transit. For ambulatory. One of them was sitting on the floor of the docking bay with her back against the wall, and her boots off, which I mentioned because the combination of posture and context was the first thing I observed before I had processed her face or her uniform or anything else. Sitting on the floor. Boots off. 11 days in a compromised outpost. Fleet intervention in her sector. Kethvar withdrawal. 19 hours of everything being enormous and consequential and terrible. And she was sitting on the floor in her socks, apparently examining a blister on her left heel, with the focused attention of someone whose nervous system had decided that the blister was currently the correct size of problem to deal with. I noted the boots. I noted the blister, which I noted the socks, which had a small patch of darker fabric at the toe where a repair had been made at some point. Worn through, stitch closed, worn through a second time partially, the kind of repair that accumulates on things that get used harder than they were made for. I looked at the socks for longer than was probably necessary. When she noticed Preth and me standing at the edge of the bay, her expression did something I wasn't prepared for. Not the wariness, basically, of someone who expects to be interviewed or assessed or processed into the administrative machinery of recovery. Something more lateral than that. A kind of evaluation that moved fast and reached a conclusion without visible deliberation. TBH, monitoring liaison, she said. Yes, I said, which was the entire truth and also completely inadequate. Okay. She didn't stand up. She looked at us with the specific quality of someone who has been awake for 11 days and has passed through fear and urgency and despair and out the other side into a place where they're very tired and also completely, unflinchingly clear about who they are and what they've been doing. I filed 41 reports, she said, It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, offered in the tone of someone who wants to establish the context before anything else happens. I know, I said. Reviewed all of them. Last night. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, I think, of the fact that someone had actually done that. Not a form acknowledgement. Not an automated receipt. A review. The first 33 are in the queue, I said. I'm aware they weren't processed in time. I filed a priority complaint with the oversight director last night. I paused. I don't know what the outcome will be. No, she said. Neither do I. Another pause, a different quality from mine. Not uncertain, just accurate. Thanks for filing it. She said, thanks for filing it the way you say something when the thing being thanked is real, but also late, and when you've decided that late does not automatically negate real. I found this not easy exactly, but right? The correct calibration for the situation. Preth, who I had underestimated repeatedly over the past 19 hours, stepped forward and sat down across from Adeyemi on the docking bay floor. I stared at her for a moment. She looked honestly back at me with an expression that said, clearly, sometimes sitting down is the correct response. Look, I sat down on the docking bay floor. Plus, in my monitoring uniform, I was aware that this wasn't standard protocol. I noted it in the margins of my thoughts and set it aside. Adeyemi looked between us. Did you hear it? She asked. Not the signal, I mean, her communication log. I could tell from the phrasing. It, not them. Communication 40, I said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and one hand was still near her boot, not quite touching it, the way hands stay near things they've put down without letting go. I didn't think anyone would, she said. You sent it anyway. Yeah. A pause that wasn't empty. I've been sending, I guess, things for 11 days. I figured one more couldn't make anything worse. Something moved across her expression. Not amusement, but in the neighborhood of it, the dry edge of a person who has found the particular dark humor of the situation and is holding it lightly, because holding things lightly is what you do when everything is heavy. I was done filing correctly. I didn't basically have anything left for the format. I know, I said again. And then, because I had been awake for 45 rest cycles and the gap in my professional behavior had widened considerably, I think the format exists for good reasons. I basically also think that when the format is the only thing left, you've already lost something important. She looked at me for a moment. The evaluation quality again. Fast, lateral, conclusive. Yeah, she said. That's about right. We talked for 41 minutes, which I've always found to be a significant number, and which was almost certainly a coincidence. I won't transcribe the conversation fully here. Some of actually, it isn't mine to transcribe. But there are pieces I've returned to often enough in the time, since that they've settled into something I carry. She told me about Corporal Fitch, which not the documentation version, the actual version. The way he, had a habit of narrating what he was doing while he worked, not to anyone in particular, just a running account to the air around him, like he needed the events of his life to be witnessed in real time rather than remembered later. That the recycler narration had become. She searched for a word and didn't find one in standard. Settled for a gesture, a small sweep of the hand that I interpreted as something that held the room together. That she had kept listening for it for 2 days after. That the silence where it had been had a shape. I told her about Communication 40. That I had read it in the middle of the night with bad coffee, and that the line about Fitch had stayed with me in the way things stay with you when they are more real than your current context. She looked at her boots for a moment. Then she said, TBH, I'm glad it went somewhere. Not, I'm glad it worked. Not, I'm glad the fleet came, and I'm glad it went somewhere. That in my opinion, things she had put into the void had been received by a specific person in a specific room who had read it and not moved on. I wrote it down in my log later, while I could still hear her voice saying it. The exact words. I wanted them exact. She told me something else. I've actually thought about whether to include this in the record, and I've decided yes, because the record is the point. She said she had known, by day 9, that the requests weren't producing results. She said she had known, by day 10, that the formal mechanism wasn't the thing that would save them. She had kept filing anyway. Not because she thought it would work, but because the act of filing was itself a thing. A refusal to stop. A way of saying, this situation is being seen by someone, even if that someone is only me. The log exists. I think the record exists. Even an unread record is better than no record, because it contains the possibility of being read. That's why I didn't stop, she said. Even when I stopped believing it was doing anything. I sat with that. There's a concept in Accord organizational doctrine. I had read it many times in the sections on mission persistence and operational continuity about the distinction between productive action and necessary action. Productive action produces results. Necessary action is, I think, what you do when results aren't yet available, and stopping would mean accepting that they are impossible. The doctrine frames it in strategic terms. Tables and flowcharts, a clinical taxonomy of persistence. What Adeyemi described was the same thing with all the doctrine stripped off. She kept filing because stopping would mean agreeing that it was over, and she wasn't going to agree to that, even alone, even when no one was listening. Not because she was certain of the outcome, because the certainty of the outcome wasn't the relevant thing. I had never TBH understood that doctrine section the way I understood it in that moment. I didn't say this to her. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew it. She had been living it for 11 days. I filed it in myself, in the part where things go when they change the shape of your thinking. She asked, well, about the fleet, which specifically about VSF redacted, which the Meridian sensors had apparently detected and logged, and which had produced a conversation among the surviving personnel about what exactly they were looking at. I can't access pretty much the specification file, I said. Neither can we, she said. Our systems just kept returning an error code. Ensign Ferreira thought it was a sensor glitch. Commander Reeves thought it was a new class. I thought, she paused. I thought it didn't matter what it was. It was on our side of the perimeter. Does it bother you not knowing? She considered this. I don't love not knowing, she said. But I've been operating on incomplete information for 11 days. You kind of get used to working with what's in front of you. A pause. What do TBH you think it is? I have been thinking about VSF redacted since I first saw the entry in the fleet registry. The specialist, I guess, deployment status, active field, the complete redaction of every specification, and the fact that it had been included in the authorization alongside 12 dreadnoughts and 43 escort vessels, and that its presence had apparently been noted by every sensor array in the Kethvar blocking force, because the withdrawal terms had been offered within 2 hours of the fleet's arrival. I think, I said carefully, that it is a thing whose purpose is to exist in the record, not to fire, to be fair, not to engage, to be known to exist. She looked at me. A deterrent, she said. Like, look, the entire fleet. Like the entire fleet. Yes, except the fleet moves. The fleet has a destination and a time of arrival and a gravitational signature you can measure. The fleet, in my opinion, is a fact you can track. In my opinion, but VSF redacted, I paused. I think VSF redacted is the answer to what happens after the fleet. And the answer being classified means the Kethvar have to imagine it. And I think Kethvar imagining it is apparently worse than them knowing. She was quiet for a moment. Turn this over. Ah, she said. And then, after a pause that was almost exactly the length of Etholin's cable braiding pauses, that's a lot like what a communication is. I looked at her. A communication exists in a record, she said. Even if nobody reads it right away, it's there. And the fact that it's there means the situation is being witnessed, even if just by the log. And the Kethvar having to think about what that means, about the Accord actually looking at what's been happening here. Another pause. I, for what it's worth, think that's probably what the fleet was answering. Not just the sound, the 41 records underneath it. I wrote this down, in the log, in real time, while she was still speaking, which is a thing I do when I want to be certain I have the exact words rather than a reconstruction of them. I kept the timestamp. She left for medical processing at 7 hours, 18 minutes, and 27 seconds. Before she went, she put her boots back on, laced them efficiently, the practice speed of someone who has performed this action under conditions that required moving fast immediately afterward. She stood up, and her uniform had the particular texture of fabric that has been worn through consecutive days without changing. Her face had the texture of 11 days of not enough sleep and too much reality. Well, she looked functional. More than functional. The kind of functional that's a choice, sustained past the point where it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like who you're. At the door, she paused. The monitoring liaison office, she said. And you said you'd file a complaint about the queue. Yes. Will it go anywhere? I thought about this honestly. I don't know. Probably not far. Probably not fast. Probably into a queue of its own. I paused. I'll file it anyway. She looked at me for a moment. Good, she said. And then, keep the timestamp open. She had not seen my log. She didn't know about the timestamp. It was a coincidence, or it was the same instinct. The same refusal to let the record close until the record is finished. Oh, I said. She left. Cycle 883, which I mean the next day. Vetholin, at some point in the intervening time, had made coffee. Real coffee. Not the analogous compound. Actual roasted seed bean extract, a bag of which he had apparently located in a personal storage locker from 8 months ago, kept against some private contingency he had not mentioned until now. He had made enough for 3 cups, and had placed one on my console without saying anything. I drank it without saying anything. It was the best coffee I'd had in 40 cycles. Possibly longer. I sat with my log open, cursor blinking in the timestamp field. The Meridian Outpost resupply was complete. Medical status: 18 personnel discharged from care, 7 receiving continued treatment for an extended recovery, all 29 alive. Commander Reeves had filed a situation report in standard format, brevity-coded, the dry professional document of someone returning to the mechanism of official record after the thing that lies under the mechanism had been briefly, terrifyingly visible. The document was correct. The boxes were checked. In the secondary notes field, Reeves had written 29 out of 47. For the record, not as a complaint, not as a request. As a fact, he needed to be in the record. For the record, I filed my own addendum to the monitoring liaison report, not procedurally required, and a supplementary observation attached as an appendix. 800 words about the communications log and what it contained and what I thought it meant about response timelines and the mechanism and the thing that lives underneath the mechanism. I don't know if anyone will read it. The oversight director hasn't responded. The queue is still the queue. Pretty much, I filed it anyway. Here is what I've concluded, which I'm also filing in the record. The Kethvar strategy was correct. And I think terms of mechanism design, blocking force, no engagement, diplomatic delay, attrition, it was correctly engineered for the situation as they understood the situation. They had run this approach successfully in 4 prior contested sector situations. The mechanism works. Pretty much, plus committees move slowly. Queues are deep. The patience of stone outlasts the urgency of anyone in particular. What they had not engineered for was a person. Not a human, basically, and a person. A specific individual who had been awake for 11 days and had 41 records in a void, and at some point reached the end of what the mechanism could contain and put something else into the channel instead. Something, to be fair, that wasn't a request. Something that didn't fit any of the formats. Something that was, I guess, just, I'm here. Plus, he was real. I need this to be known. And what I've decided and what I'm filing is this. The mechanism exists for good reasons. The mechanism fails for the same reasons it works, which is that it is designed to manage situations and not to witness them. And sometimes a situation does not need to be managed. It needs to be witnessed. And if the mechanism cannot witness, if the formats have replaced the attention, if the queue has replaced the response, then the thing underneath the mechanism will find a different channel. Pretty much, it always does. It always will, which cycle 883. 14 hours, 52 minutes, and 7 seconds. I've been awake for 58 consecutive rest cycles, and I'm going to sleep after I file this. VSF Redacted remains in its position at the Meridian perimeter, classified, doing whatever it does, which I'm still not permitted to know. The fleet is beginning a long cycle holding pattern. The diplomatic processors are drafting the formal terms of the Kethvar withdrawal. The queue is processing, and forms are being filled. The small, real machinery of the record continuing. I have one more thing to note, and then I'm going to close this log and sleep. Preth told me this morning. She had apparently looked it up, because Preth is the kind of junior analyst who looks things up and then tells you what she found whether or not you asked, that the human acoustic event, the signal, the thing Adeyemi broadcast on that raw channel at 14 minutes and 7 seconds, has a name. Not in xenolinguistics, not in the Accord acoustic taxonomy. In human culture itself. They have a word for it. It is the word for what a person does when they've experienced something too large to hold inside the normal channels of expression, and they release it, not to communicate, not to signal, but simply because a person cannot hold that much and stay intact. The word is a whale. Preth told me this with a particular quality she's been developing over the past 2 cycles of offering me information I'm clearly going to sit with for a long time. She was right that I was going to sit with it. A whale, crossing 17 frequency bands, into the nebula, into the void, and into an Accord monitoring bay where a tired officer with bad coffee had his secondary nervous system do something he didn't have a clean word for. Into the record. I'm keeping the timestamp open.